I come from a past century called the 1900s when electric guitar and a lot of the music as we know it today was invented. You can ask questions about the 1900s in the comments section if you need to. I've been playing guitar professionally in one capacity or another for over 30 years in wildly different genres. I do session work and music production in here every day, and I do gig out. So I'm trying to offer somewhat of a pro perspective on this topic as someone who's been messing with this stuff for almost 4 decades now. When I started out, we just played crappy solid state practice amps and maybe 1 or 2 cheap pedals until we could afford a nice tube amp. And until then, our tone sounded like unfiltered cigarettes on a freezing cold day. Eventually, over the years, I owned some great amps. I had some wonderful Marshalls, Fenders, Voxes, and also some not so great iterations of all 3 of those. A lot of my favorite guitar sounds are rooted in the late 60s and early 70s. And so I love amps. I even love thinking about amps, if that makes sense. But I've also been very open to amp emulation ever since it started, both analog and digital. I had the cool rack units in the 90s, like the Quadraverb GT and the Rocktron Chameleon and the Sansamp PSA 21. All of them had some great sounds. I've used Line 6 amp modeling ever since the very start, Amp Farm for Pro Tools and the Pod Bean 1.0, and especially the Pod XT Pro, which I traveled and toured with. Also amp modeling plugins like Amplitude, S-Gear, etc., etc. And Helix, I got the first day that it came out, and I've used it daily since 2015. And finally, I'm so grateful to have my 4 different Mesa Boogie amps, which are sort of the soul of my studio. They can each do a ton of different tones, especially when paired up with the aux box, which allows me to use different cabs and mics. So that's my amp story in a nutshell. Amp modeling seems to have come of age in the past few years. A lot of major touring acts have switched to modeling setups by Fractal, Line 6, Universal Audio, and others in these big budget stadium shows where they could easily be using the tube rigs of the gods. So, and we all know the positives of digital, the convenience, the consistency night to night, portability or, flyability, and the relative reliability compared to finicky old tube technology. But we also know the negative modeling narrative, that they just don't have the same soul and dynamics and warmth as the real deal. But interestingly, as of the mid-2020s, we're hearing a lot less complaining about the sound of high-end modelers. It's almost as if people who know how to get great analog tones are also getting great tones from modelers. Just imagine that. Even diehard tube amp fans are now talking about the inevitable impending death of real amps. And I'll admit that right now, I know I can get a killer professional guitar sound from any decent modeler in minutes, if not seconds. So the question is, if modelers are so good now, why do so many of us still use tube amps? I can't speak for anyone else, but here are my 4 reasons. Number 1, inspiration. There is something undeniably magical about plugging in to a great tube amp, especially at its ideal operating volume, which is roughly loud enough to compete with a live drummer in rehearsal or to completely drown out a normal conversation. All that stuff about moving air and real amp feel and amp in the room, it's real.
All of it. It's all true.
It's true in the garage and it's true on the gig. To deny this is folly. If you're of the generation that grew up on plugins and haven't even experienced what those plugins are trying to emulate, you really owe it to yourself to play through a tube amp. Number 2, reference. Analog keeps you honest. If you are accustomed to listening to really great tube amps on a regular basis, your standards will be super high and they'll even change the way you dial in modelers. This is the case with analog pedals, electric piano, organ, consoles, tape, any classic technology. Hearing the real thing will reset your ear and teach you what it is you are trying to get from the digital version. Number 3, history. Working with tube amps, you are reminded of what made great guitar tones even a thing in the first place, which of course is the sound of all the classic blues, rock, country, and R&B and soul records of the 20th century. And in our digital age right now, it's fascinating to have a row of hot World War II era vacuum tubes glowing and heating up the whole room to get your guitar tone. It doesn't mean that you only want to get retro sounds, but guitar players do tend to be very in touch with the history and the context of their instrument, and we find it deeply intriguing and mysterious and sexy. And number 4, a change of pace. When you have a digital workflow like I have, for example, with Helix Native, which I use almost every day, sometimes you need to exit that environment and do things in a completely different way, even if you're getting great sounds. It's like taking a different route to walk home from the store. Sometimes you need to mix it up so it doesn't become Groundhog Day. That's a 1900s reference for you guys. Now, I know that these answers of mine aren't completely objective or empirical. They have a lot to do with mojo and vibe and other unquantifiables, right? But may I remind you, we are talking about music here. Music itself lives squarely in the domain of vibe and mojo and is itself super subjective. So it makes sense that the tools that we use to create music aren't always evaluated with cold, hard logic. So yes, real amps rip. Of course they do. Everybody knows that. And so the other question becomes, if you have nice tube amps, why on earth would you still use modelers? Oh, there are reasons. 4 of them to be exact, and they're nothing to do with economics or baggage restrictions. Number 1, workflow. Sometimes it's more about capturing the idea rather than crafting a tone. With modeling, especially with plugins, you can refine the tone after you've come up with the building blocks of your guitar part, sometimes even after you've already tracked it. Helix Native in particular has become an essential part of my writing and production process because I'm constantly getting ideas about the guitar sound, even later on when I'm working on vocals or whatever else. Or during mixdown, I still have full control over every little aspect of the sound, which I change around with automation. I'll try to make a video about that. Number 2, versatility. Modelers have a zillion different effect options for effects before and after the amp, options for the amps and speakers and mics themselves. All these different options, they can sometimes lead to option paralysis, but other times they help you find the perfect sound or even maybe inspire the perfect part. I like knowing that I can try 5 different big muff pedals or 5 flangers in the next 30 seconds and pick the one that knocks me out. Number 3, recall. Bringing up a session, I still have the original tone for further playing or editing. Or even to go back and see how I got a sound from a couple of years ago. And I actually do this quite a bit to use it as a starting point for a new sound. And number 4 is the same as on the amp list. Change of pace. Again, switching to a different mode of working can zap your creative brain and give you a new perspective. This can keep things fun and interesting and allow you to constantly try new things. Like I said, we never want it to get too repetitive and predictable around here. So the through line is that getting tones and playing guitar are acts of creativity. Writing and arranging music, perhaps even more so. So it's very important to me personally to have different tools for the job. And I also hybridize these tools all the time The other day, I tracked a heavy rock part through my Mesa Mark V, but in front of the amp, I had my Helix shifting my pitch down a whole step and emulating a Boss Super overdrive pedal, which sound great in front of high gain amps. And on live gigs, I tend to do this too. I'll bring out the California Tweed, set it fairly clean, and use Helix for all my effects, even my overdrive sound, especially now that they have the Nobels in there. So if an analog pedal or a certain guitar or amp or a piece of software allows you to access the right part of your brain in the heat of the moment, then that is the right tool, period. Sometimes it has to be a fire-breathing old tube amp rig that's way too heavy and needs a fresh $100 set of 6L6 power tubes once in a while. If that's where the magic comes from, then great. Other times it's all about the part and experimenting and being your own engineer and moving virtual blocks around until the heavens open and your song or your soul gets the thing that it needs. Sometimes you use one or the other. Sometimes you combine the two. Sometimes one even has to replace the other in weird or surprising ways. It's all about whatever inspires and brings you joy. I am totally not interested in the dichotomy of real versus modeled or analog versus digital in the 21st century. I love all of it. And I truly mean I love all of it. You can see I have an analog synth over here too. I use the virtual stuff as well. If it gets me where I'm trying to go on a particular day, then that's what I use. Whatever inspires and brings you joy. Because that, beloveds, is what music and making music is supposed to do. Onwards.